Hey there, Abe Pushers. This is Mr. Eskridge and Mr. Vier coming at you with Chapter 7 of American Yop, the Early Republic. All right, so I'm going to start us off here. So the first thing that the chapter goes into is really this kind of challenge to slavery that we're starting to see at this time after we have the United States formed as a nation, founded on these ideas of liberty, equality, freedom of the individual, that all men are created equal. People are starting to test that idea, how, kind of this dichotomy between these ideas of freedom, equality, liberty, and then this institution of slavery, or the peculiar institution, as it will be called as we move through this portion of history. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is the fact that the Haitian Revolution really scared the crap out of white planters. And what the Haitian Revolution showed was that Africans enslaved persons could rise up, could revolt against their masters, against the people that were holding them in the status of slavery, and they were willing to go to extreme measures to defend themselves, defend their livelihood, defend each other against this forced situation in which they found themselves. And so Haiti is still a country today in the Caribbean, or in the located near Cuba, just south of the United States. Sorry, I had a little brain fart there. And so we really see this idea of the Haitian Revolution, and the fact of the Haitian Revolution is really scaring the crap out of white slaveholders in the United States. And so people start to argue about, what would happen what would that look like if it happened here? And so we start to see these different categories of race, and really trying to scientifically show that African Americans are different, that they were in fact, a different kind of race, a different group of people, and therefore that justified their condition as being enslaved persons. We're also seeing a lot of white publication are mocking Black Americans, starting to ridicule them. But we see Black Americans on the other side starting to push for abolition, starting to push against these ideas of enslavement, and starting to demand some of the freedoms that are shown in the Constitution and during the American Revolution. So I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Vieira, who's going to talk about Jefferson, who was a slaveholder himself.
All right, what's up, guys? So we have the Revolution of 1800, and the Revolution of 1800 is revolutionary in the sense that political power swung from one ideology to a completely different ideology. And so Jefferson's election in 1800 represents this shift in power in the hands of the elitist Federalist Party to power in the hands of more common white males in the United States. Now, during his presidency, despite the fact that Jefferson ideologically believed that power should be in the hands of free people and free people can govern themselves directly, you really don't see a lot of change in terms of the way that American democracy is carried out. That's not going to be for another 20 to 30 years with Andrew Jackson's presidential election. Jefferson is a very wealthy man, and his presidency pretty much kind of shows his wealth. There's no change in slavery. There's no change in the voting rights or anything like that. So it's revolutionary in the sense that one political faction takes over, but it's not really revolutionary socially or economically in any way, shape, or form. Women continue to have really no voice in his government and in the United States government, and there's a real push by the Republican Party, the party of Jefferson, to have more and more women look for spouses that are Republican. And this idea of the Republican motherhood, you really see kind of strengthened in the role of what a woman's role is in American society at the time. Now, in practice, to get to a little bit more brass tacks with Jefferson's presidency and what type of president he was, one of the first things that he does is he pardons many of the people who had been serving time in prison under the Alien and Sedition Act. He returns naturalization back to 5 years. This is important because many of the people who were imprisoned by the Alien and Sedition Act were political rivals of the Federalists, and so by default were allies of Thomas Jefferson. It's a way for him to sort of strengthen his base and undo some of the damage to his political party that had been done by the Federalists. He repeals the excise tax, which, as we know, was one of the main causes of the Whiskey Rebellion. And that's another way to help farmers, which, again, farmers were a huge base of Jefferson's support. One of the kind of things about Thomas Jefferson that is sort of unique is that Thomas Jefferson, in terms of his conservative views on the federal government, he talked the talk and he walked the walk. He actually reduces the national debt, he balances the budget, and he makes the army as small as humanly possible under his presidency. So those ideas that he had of a small centralized federal government that is weak, that doesn't have much power, he really stayed true to that, so much so that he even got rid of most of the military, which is something that's pretty novel by today's standards, but even for that time period, was sort of unheard of. The one thing that, constitutionally speaking, Jefferson struggles with is the Louisiana Purchase. Now, the Louisiana Purchase, for obvious reasons, benefited the United States of America. When Thomas Jefferson is approached with the opportunity to purchase this huge swath of land, which would double the size of the country, he's not really sure that he legally can do it. And in his writings and letters that we have from Thomas Jefferson, he actually believed that by doing this, he was violating the Constitution. But he said he threw himself at the mercy of the people, that if it was wrong, that they would find him wrong and perhaps reverse his decision. But this opportunity for him to expand this agrarian vision that he had of the United States of America was just too good to pass up. So Louisiana will be bought for $15 million. And here's, you see it on a map. It doubles the size of the United States of America, and it sets a precedent for westward expansion and this idea, and I think this is the first time we're using this term, manifest destiny. Yeah, big time. So this is the beginning of westward movement, further encroachment into Indian territory, further encroachment onto Native American lands, and we begin to rev up closer to Spanish territory in the southwest of what is today the modern United States of America. So Jefferson's presidency is not without controversy. Europe is embroiled in a war, and one of the ways in which Jefferson tries to prevent Americans from being involved in this war is through passing the Embargo Act of 1807. Now, the Embargo Act of 1807 basically says America's not going to trade with anybody. That way we won't have our ships targeted. We will not look like we're taking sides in any European conflict. The problem with this is trade creates jobs, trade helps businesses, et cetera, and by not trading, the United States goes into a severe depression. One of the positives of the Embargo Act, if you can actually find a positive, is that you begin to see northern businesses start to invest and build things that normally Americans had imported from Europe. But because of the embargo and because of our lack of trade, we have to make that, as a nation, we have to make those products on our own. Jefferson's racial policies are something that's been studied and written about and discussed for, literally centuries now. The Federalists attack him for having a relationship with one of his slaves named Sally Hemings, which is obviously something that we know now to be factual. Jefferson is criticized throughout his presidency and throughout his pretty much adult life for wanting to instill racial equality in the United States. Now, this is hardly true. Jefferson had slaves pretty much his whole entire life. He's one of the largest slave owners in the United States during his lifetime. But this is something that sort of follows him and is something that the Federalist Party is able to use against him to the rest of the voting population, which, of course, during this time period is landowning white males. Despite controversy in his life, Thomas Jefferson, and in his presidency, Thomas Jefferson's election really does signify kind of the rise of a new political establishment in America, and along with some other factors, the death of the Federalist Party. So we'll discuss that in more detail here coming up shortly. Hey guys, it's Mr. Vieira. Just real quick before we continue on and finish up with Chapter 7, it's important to know that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 4th of July in 1826. Here's Mr. Eskridge.
All right, hey guys. All right, so I'm here to talk about what happened, the consequences of the Louisiana Purchase and the consequences of the United States now having more territory. And so the first thing that we're going to turn to is Native American power. And so as the United States is continuing to further push further and further west, we start to have more conflicts with Native Americans. At the outset, we have Americans and Native Americans kind of playing out what the traditional diplomatic relations that they had prior to the Revolution, in which Native Americans were able to relatively skillfully kind of play the European powers off of each other, or this playoff system, and kind of get what they wanted. Now that we have the Louisiana Purchase, we're having further and further conflict between Native Americans and Americans who are pushing onto Native American lands in hope of making a life for themselves. That being Americans who want a part of this American dream, want that 40 acres and that land, so that they can have that land, so that they can participate in this democracy and also just make a living, live out the American dream. And so we're starting to see during this time, as diplomatic relations or treaties are starting to fall apart, we have Native Americans that are rising up and saying, this is enough. We are going to be completely destroyed if we continue to allow the Americans to make a treaty with us and then renege on that treaty or throw it out the window and just take our land anyway. So we have two brothers, Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, who also known as the Prophet. And what's significant about these two brothers is that they're able to unify large numbers, large groups of Native Americans in this region against American encroachment. And what they're able to do is to bring a pan-Native American resistance movement in order to stand unified against American invasion onto their lands. And so they use spirituality, as the Prophet is able to say that, kind of blending Christianity and Native American mythology, to say that it is their destinies, that our will is the will of their God, the master of life, in order to see the Native Americans realize their own sovereign territory. Tecumseh dies later in the War of 1812, but before he does so, he successfully leads many battles between Native Americans and Americans. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, the Americans were able to win many more battles, and so ultimately the pan-Native American resistance really starts to kind of go away, and it certainly disappears with the death of Tecumseh during the War of 1812. And so we're starting to see, as Native American lands were captured and were taken over and would become the United States, we're seeing this institution of slavery continuing to move westward in the South. And so that's going to obviously become an issue once we get up to the Civil War, and we have the fight over slavery and whether or not to allow it in the Union. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Vieira, who's going to talk about the causes of the War of 1812.
All right, so we're just going to go over causes and effects of the War of 1812 real quick. Again, it's not a military history class, guys. So we're focusing on how wars and conflicts really shape and change the course of American history. One of the things that Jefferson did, or one of the things that happens after Jefferson left office, is Congress lifts the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act had been devastating towards the American economy, and so Americans begin to trade. But as Americans begin to trade, some of the old conflicts between the British Empire and the United States start to re-arise. The first and most obvious cause of the War of 1812 is this idea of impressment. American sailors were oftentimes, their ships were stopped at sea by the powerful British Navy, and they would be impressed into service. What that means is they would be used in the British Navy, aboard British ships, as deckhands for their Navy. This obviously is viewed as an infringement on American sovereignty and in the American rights, and so this is going to anger the American population, especially those working and living in port cities in the Northeast. Also, the British continued to have rather good relations and supply Native Americans with weapons, with material, with money. They trade and do business with Native Americans who had been in conflict with the United States of America, which as it's pushing farther and farther west. You begin to see during this time period a faction of the Republican Party that is really pushing for war, that really views the infringement and some of the things that the British had been doing as call for war. Two figures in particular who are going to be, we're introduced to these two gentlemen in chapter 7, and they'll be huge parts of American history for the next 30 or 40 years. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun. Both men are going to be icons in the U.S. Senate and will really put their stamp on American history and the 19th century. So these various factors, the impressment of American sailors, the continued support of Native Americans by the British Empire, and just kind of the war hysteria that's going on, forces James Madison to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And on June 18th, 1812, the United States will again, after only about 30 years of peace, go to war with the British Empire. So to go over the effects of that war, here again to finish it off is Mr. Eskridge.
All right, hey guys. So just the consequences, just really quickly. So not all Americans supported going to war. We did have the war hawks, and many people in the West, and many Republicans are supporting going to war against Britain. But we have Federalists who meet at the Hartford Convention in Hartford, up in New England in 1814, and basically what they're saying is they're making they're declaring their resistance to the war. They're saying that they should restructure the U.S. Constitution to make it more difficult for the country to go to war. And so they don't really have a lot of support, and rumors come out in the papers that they are talking about leaving the Union or seceding. And so that really leads to the end of the Federalist Party, and it's the death knell of the party that we'll see. And they're pretty much going to disappear into the history of the United States. The war really strengthened the sense of nationalism for the American people. So, after the American Revolution, people had kind of, went back to their day-to-day lives and had kind of forgotten about, the nationalism that was really alive during that time. And so with the War of 1812, one of the things that it did, it really reinvigorated this nationalism. We have things like the Star-Spangled Banner. We have Americans that are just emboldened with fighting and winning a lot of battles against the British. And ultimately, the United States, supposedly wins the war. The war ends. No one really wins. No one really loses. But the United States is able to maintain its territory and is able to, again, show that it can play with the big boys, if you will. We see what another thing that comes out of it is Henry Clay rising to prominence, comes with this American system, which is supported by a strong national banking system, a protective tariff for U.S. businesses, which we'll continue to see the tariff play a really big role in U.S. history. And it also results in a network of roads and canals. So it's really like building the economic infrastructure of the United States so that the United States can become the economic powerhouse that it will become. Another thing that the war does is it brings to fame Andrew Jackson, who is a war hero. He leads the American forces to a victory in the Battle of New Orleans. If you had died during that battle, you probably would have been like, oh, that sucks, because the war was actually declared over before that battle happened. So I don't know, just a little fun fact of history. Another thing that we see the United States issuing, so James Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, emboldened by the War of 1812 and the relative success there. And basically what the Monroe Doctrine says is it declares that the Western Hemisphere is off limits to European influence, European control, and that the United States will defend and will protect and will look out for the welfare of not only North America, not only its territory, but also Central and South America as well. So basically, stamping this is our territory. You are not allowed here, and we are willing to defend it if necessary. So we're going to see, this continuing change in America and the world. All right, guys. So just a quick reminder: Chapter 7 reading quiz on Monday, there's a reading quiz every Monday. So have a good weekend, and we'll see you guys back in a couple weeks. Have a good one. Bye.